Hello and welcome to our panelists and participants from around the world. First of all, let me introduce our next speaker, Mr. Thomas McDavid. He's the chairman of the Washington Times, USA. Mr. Tom McDavid is also the company of the board director of the company. He has been with the news media company since 1994, apart from serving as senior vice president of the marketing and communications at Points of Light Foundation, which was launched by the former president, George W. Bush. And Mr. David also serves as the global coordinator of IMAP and IAED, both new global projects of the UPF International. So let's welcome Mr. Thomas McDavid. Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Peter, for that kind introduction. And special thanks for your steady and effective leadership in the role of global coordinator, of regional coordinator for the Europe and Middle East area for IMAP. So proud of what you're doing. It's also a special honor to work together with the Honorable Jacques Marion, who heads up UPF in your area. And I see also my good friend and colleague, Dr. Michael Jenkins, International President of UPF. And most of all, to be on a panel with some friends and colleagues like Guy Taylor from the Washington Times and Jungmi Huang, my good friend from Seoul, Korea, with Sege Ilbo, our sister newspaper, who together we put on the World Summit in 2020. And Andrew Salmon, who used to be with the Times, now with Asia Times. And Andrew, I got to tell you, I read your pieces along with Guy anytime I see them on Asia Times every morning, pretty much a couple times a week at least. And your coverage recently of Afghanistan, I thought was very, very insightful, let alone China and Korea. Ladies and gentlemen, we're focused today on what role the media should play to bring about a peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula. Allow me to frame our discussion with some context and background. Having worked with the founders of UPF and the Washington Times for over the past 48 years, I applaud Dr. Hak Ja-han Moon for her exceptional leadership in such a time as this. This is not your typical NGO or a typical religious or advocacy organization. What I think is happening is the emergence of a civilization-level movement based on an enlightened grand strategy that is rooted in the ideals of interdependence, mutual prosperity, and universal values. It's absolutely fascinating to watch this, but most of all, it's so inspiring to be part of it. And I encourage all of you who are watching to check it out. If this is your first time, get involved with UPF. It's really making a difference. It's becoming more clear every week that the situation on the Korean Peninsula, especially in light of the aggressive global intentions of China, is a doorway that can open a great era of peace and prosperity, or it can plunge the world into a very dark and dangerous future. It is such a critical time that we are in. And I'd like to address a couple of points that I hope will be of use for to give context to our panelists coming up. Our era is overcome with multidimensional critical challenges. Consider the tragedies unfolding in Afghanistan these past couple of weeks. The COVID-19 pandemic has wreaked havoc and suffering throughout the world. Social norms have been disrupted. There's massive changes happening the world over, especially as things shift from an Atlantic-centered civilization to the Asia-Pacific region, which is emerging as dominant. Clearly, the world is experiencing huge disruption. How we view these challenges is so important. As journalists, it's vital to seek what is most essential in order to report the news with accuracy, fairness, and relevance. Let's talk about our time. In my decades of learning from and working with the late Dr. Sun Myung Moon and Dr. Hak Ja-han Moon, their insights, guidance, and scholarship, their practice on the nature of our era are singularly profound. For example, Reverend Moon predicted in 1985 that the Soviet Union would collapse long before anyone would have expected it. Centered upon their legacy and their leadership, UPF and its various associations are uniquely situated to play a significant role via track 2 diplomacy and soft power. Consider both Father and Mother Moon are originally from North Korea. Both are sincerely respected there. The global and multifaceted movement that they've generated fully supports peaceful reunification. We see two Koreas so different in outcomes, but with the same culture, history, and language in many ways. Going back a few years ago when Dr. Hak Ja-moon was speaking before 80 members of the US Congress, she said, "We look at this world and see unspeakable, inarticulate misery happening around the globe. This is impossible to solve with mere human power. What should we do from here on forward?" She challenged these members of the US Congress. We need to start a movement that once again attends God as the original owner of the universe in our families, countries, and world. However, the reality is that although our hearts are eager to attend God, it's hard to practice in real life. Very interesting words to share with a body like that. In the face of so many critical challenges around the world, in our nation's communities and homes, even our personal lives, I believe we're witnessing the phenomenon of a new global great awakening, and that this requires a new mindset, an enlightened grand strategy, and new leadership, especially that of women. As the evangelical historical philosopher Os Guinness likes to say, contrast is the mother of clarity. Contrast is the mother of clarity. When the world seems so dark, the emerging light of a new view of life centered on the highest ideals of true love that transcends the barriers of race, religion, culture, and national boundaries is now becoming more evident with each passing day. This is the new view of reality that is beginning to take root and generate culture. That's the stuff that we as journalists need to be watching for, to tell the world where we can find real hope and opportunity. In 1978, Dr. Sun Myung Moon spoke before a couple thousand journalists at the World Media Association. This was in the Soviet Union. More than ever before, he said, the pen is mightier than the sword. I have always believed that the media must be free and that a free press must also be a responsible press, and that a responsible press is a moral press. What do I mean by a moral media, said Reverend Moon? He said, a moral media is society's conscience. The media needs to be society's conscience. In February 2020, as a key aspect of the World Summit 2020 that many of us worked on together, attracted 500 some journalists from 70 countries, we launched the International Media Association for Peace, or the acronym IMAP. It was organized under the banner of UPF and has chapters in 150 countries, something like that. It was to commemorate the centenary of Dr. Moon's birth. IMAP was launched at Mrs. Moon's request, Dr. Hak Ja-moon's behest, with the mission to address the current crises in media credibility, media standards and ethics, and the seemingly never-ending industry upheavals and innovations. IMAP encourages the development of a free and responsible global media industry that is highly trusted, independent and prosperous, and accessible to all people. And as a peace in the IMAP name suggests, we encourage news media to shine a light on dialogue, collaboration, conflict resolution, and most of all, to focus on solutions. As Ronald Reagan used to say, let's focus on what works as a way of promoting human development, God-given human rights, freedom in the media, freedom of speech, etc., human rights and social well-being, freedom and prosperity. So we invite all of you to participate in this effort with UPF, with IMAP, and be involved so that it helps your professional and personal development and can open doors to a valuable network of people all over the world. Let's work together to build a world of lasting peace, prosperity, and human fulfillment centered on God. And let's help the media move forward by being engaged. Thanks so much for taking time to be part of this. And let's listen to these great panelists coming up. They've got so much wisdom and experience to share. Thank you very much, Peter. Back to you.
Thank you, Tom. Very great summary. Let me just ask you one question. Is it okay? Yeah.
Sure.
A number of journalists argue that they have a problem with the notion of being engaged in peacemaking. They say that they are not activists. They're rather just reporting the facts as they are, not taking any sides. In other words, they say they are committed to objectivity and non-partisanship. How can IMAP, the International Media Association for Peace, reconcile its activist approach with a non-activist approach? What would be your answer to these journalists?
Well, I think it's a great question. And I think at the heart of it, it's not a matter of encouraging journalists to be activists as much as to practice the classical ideal of journalism, to be objective, to be fair, to get both sides, but to penetrate the key issues of the day and to be courageous. So I think if journalism was able to move forward and raise its quality, rise up above the polarization and certainly the celebrity notions that many journalists have, I think a lot of good would come from that. So I think it's a question. The purpose of IMAP is really not so much to promote activism in journalism, but to promote the value and quality of journalism, to get back on track and to focus on where things are working and what the root of these problems are, not to hide from them. That's what I think. I think we've got a lot to learn from the people that are going to speak to us today.
Thank you. Great answer. Now, our next speaker will be Mr. Andrew Salmon. I met Andrew in Seoul, Korea, when I was reporting about human rights issues, Chinese refugees. So, and he was very kind to invite me to the Foreign Journalist Association in Korea. And we had a great team of journalists there. So Mr. Andrew Salmon, Northeast Asia correspondent of Asia Times. This is a Seoul-based Englishman. Andrew Salmon has been since 2018 Northeast Asia editor for Asia Times. Prior to that, he covered the Koreas for a range of outlets. A graduate of the University of Kent and the School of Oriental and African Studies, University of London. He is the author of 5 books, including the Korean War, Combat Histories, To the Last Round, and Scorched Earth, Black Snow. His writing on the war has been honored with awards from Queen Elizabeth II and the National Assembly of the Republic of Korea. Let's welcome Andrew. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And that's a very kind and genteel introduction, Peter. So yeah, I mean, let me just begin by addressing the point you just made to Thomas, which I think is absolutely critical to what we do as journalists. And that point is, what is our duty? What is our role? I would argue very, very strongly that the journalist, particularly the most basic journalistic beast, is the reporter. His or her job is to record the facts on the ground. It is not to be a diplomat. It's not to be a policymaker. It's definitely not to be a warrior. So, but what gives us value then? What makes our work worthwhile for humankind? I would say what we do is what literature does, and what basically the classic IT, which is written language, does. It shares the consciousness of humanity. I may write in the English language. Someone else who reads the English language at a different time, at a different place, a different gender, a different culture, can understand that we share certain human emotions and empathies. And this is the universal importance of language and literature, and indeed journalism, because journalism is the most immediate form of this empathy or emotion share. So that having been said, we need to report human stories that have immediacy. And that immediately gives us a problem here in Korea, because what we have now is an absolute black hole in our coverage of of half the story. I'm sitting here 30 miles from a border which is impenetrable, and that border has become more impenetrable in the last 2 years because of COVID. North Korea, which was always the most isolated and insulated country in the region, is now even more isolated and more insulated. And this is hugely problematic if we want to see the faces and hear the voices of the average North Korean. So that's a very, very difficult story to report right now. But there's another issue, and that issue is, if you really want a good sort of take on North Korea, maybe the best place to do it is not Pyongyang. It might be on the China-Korea border. And I'm telling you guys, if you haven't been up there, try and get up there. It's the modern Casablanca. This is where activity, trade, interaction is underway. And let me do what reporters do. Let me tell you a story. I did 2 back-to-back documentaries on the China border and also in Sinju in North Korea in 2015 and 2016. I was up there with a South Korean TV crew for about a week on each time. And none of us had journalist visas. We went in on tourist visas because getting a journalist visa in China, you know, is a Byzantine sort of maze of bureaucracy. So we went in as tourists. I was filming on a railway crossing just north of the Amnok-gang, or the Yalu River. We were stopped by secret police, guys in black suits. Later, filming on the Tumen River, we were stopped by 2 Chinese soldiers, uniform, camouflage, you know, men of war. Both those times, those interactions were completely civilized, completely polite. The Chinese were extremely decent, and we just went about our business. Today, in the new China of Xi Jinping, I would not dare to do that. A good friend of mine who I last spoke to during that trip is now in prison, serving an 11-year sentence for allegedly spying, revealing national security secrets. Mike Spavor, the Canadian, whose name I'm sure you've heard. So now, not only can we not get into North Korea, we can't really, most of us can't get into China. We can't do meaningful reporting from there. So the human story is becoming very obscured. But of course, journalism has a separate, an additional function, which is not just reporting the human story, it's analyzing what's going on. If you want to analyze the Koreas, the best place to be, I think, is right here in South Korea, because for obvious reasons, there's an intense and extraordinary national interest in South Korea and what's happening in North Korea. This is normal, this is natural. And there's an entire industry of North Korea watchers here. There are defectors, there are pundits, various experts, specialist medias. So this is a good place from which to report North Korea. Ironically, probably a better place to report North Korea than North Korea itself. A friend of mine was the task correspondent in North Korea for 3 years. And he said, I did 2 stories. I broke 2 stories in my time in Pyongyang in 3 years. And both those stories were wrong. So that gives you some idea of the difficulty of reporting and analyzing from inside North Korea. But let's return to where I am, which is South Korea. And I mean, I'm looking at South Korea now through a very, very different lens, given the traumatic and distressing scenes we're seeing from Afghanistan, which I cannot but understand as a drastic failure, not just of America, but of the wider Western alliance. And the fall of Kabul is important because, of course, Seoul fell to both the North Koreans and the Chinese, but eventually was returned to democratic rule. And I'm sitting in that city now. And I think it's very, very important that to look at the big picture here. And this is where we must be analysts. We talk about Afghan as the longest American war, 20 years. You had GIs, boots on the ground in South Korea since 1945. Look at the results. This country is one of the greatest national success stories of the 20th century, of any time in recent history, be it politically, be it economically, be it technologically, be it socially. This is a country that's busted all the right moves. And those moves were made for and by the Korean people through their own blood, sweat, and tears. But they could only manage that under the aegis of the Western alliance, and most particularly behind the shield of the United States. So I think at this time and this place where we're seeing these disastrous scenes from Afghanistan, let's consider what could have been a much longer term engagement, a much better engagement, a more value-added, deeply entangled engagement across political, economic, trade, commercial, diplomatic strata, rather than this very one-sided idea of winning a war against terrorism and not really doing the right thing and taking a long-term approach and doing nation building. So let me return now to the role of media, and let me give I've given you some analysis. Let me give you now my human story, my personal point of view. You know, I have chosen as an Englishman to live and report from South Korea. I've been very, very well treated in this country. I think on balance, Korea has been good to me. It's been kind to me. I'm a fan of this country. I've sired a Korean daughter. So whether I like it or not, the simple fact of the matter is that in my DNA, in the depths of my consciousness, I do indeed have a human attachment to South Korea and to the broader Korean Peninsula. So do emotions, do personal experiences act as obstacles to objectivity? Arguably, possibly they do. But I would say what's much more important is the depth of this engagement, and I think some knowledge and perhaps wisdom that this has given me balances that partisan bias. But on the other hand, and to finish what I have to say, that bias, that partisanship, I don't apologize for. I think in the analytical framework, South Korea has done the right thing. Maybe, just maybe, one day in the future, South Korea and North Korea will, in some way, shape, or form, which is unknown to us at this moment. There's no plan, there's no process, there's no strategy, but they may well unite. And if that happens, that can be a great moment for humanity. I'll be fascinated to be part of that. And if these hopes and dreams and wishes and biases make me less of a reporter and more of a policymaker, more of a diplomat, even more of a warrior, so be it. I have no apology to make.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
Very good points. Yeah, I hope you become a warrior, to be honest.
I hope I won't. That'll be a very, very bad outcome for Korea. And that bad outcome is always over our heads.
I just have one more brief question. You have got 1 minute to answer. Is there a role for media projects with shared objectives, like a Korean film, for example, or a photography competition, or an exhibition open to creative photographers across the Korean Peninsula for human, cultural, and landscape photographs? Is there such a role, you think?
I mean, you know, why not? I'm a believer in engagement. I do not in any way support the North Korean system. I think it crushes the human spirit. I think it's an extremely dubious polity. I think it's a system that exists for the benefit of a tiny number and to the detriment of the far greater number of people. But that having been said, there is still an argument for human engagement, you know, across any way, shape, or form. And if that engagement is in a photography competition, if it's in an exchange of journalists, if it's in diplomatic behavior, I mean, bring it on. Yeah, why not? I don't see a downside to that kind of engagement.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Let me introduce our next speaker now. She's Korean, Miss Young-mi Hwang. She's the vice president of Segye Times, one of the Korean major newspapers in the Republic of Korea. Ms. Young-mi Hwang previously served as the editor-in-chief editorial member and national political editor of the Second Times in Korea. She has a master's degree in political science from Sogang University. She completed a Knight Wallace Fellowship for journalists at the University of Michigan in USA. Ms. Wang is currently the executive editor and vice president of the Second Times in Korea. Ms. Wang, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me. I've been working for the Second Times for years as a reporter, editor-in-chief, so now as the executive editor. When I was covering the Blue House, the Korean president office, I visited North Korea in 2000. It was to cover the first inter-Korean summit between the President Kim Dae-jung and North Korean leader Kim Jong-il. Yeah, it was the most memorable experience in my career. I want to share this picture. I'm sure that everybody remember this photo. So it is the Pyongyang airport. It's a really historical moment. Yeah, I was there. And we stayed for 3 days. It is the last day, actually last dinner. They hold hands and sang together. This song title was Our Wish is Unification. This very popular song in Korea.
Excuse me, actually, we cannot see full
yeah,
screen.
anyway, all of the reporters had to cover and report on the history moments in an extremely restricted environment. They assigned they assigned one guide to each reporter. So I was assigned a female guide. She said she was an employee of the Pyongyang publishing company. Yeah, but I knew all of the guys, including her, were well-trained intelligence agents. They made it impossible for us to contact the interviews ordinary people there. For 3 days, I realized for sure how different we were. Although we spoke the same language, Korean, but our views of the world, as well as our national systems, totally different. So, and what struck me the most was their blind praise for Kim Jong-il. They were living in the country of Kim Jong-il, by Kim Jong-il, for Kim Jong-il. Now they are living in the country of Kim Jong-un, by Kim Jong-un, for Kim Jong-un. The point is that the two Koreas have lived in such different cultures for 70 years. It's a long period. I believe the reunification of Korea should be achieved in the most peaceful way. So one of the best ways is to tell the people of North Korea the truth about outside the world. I think North Korean people live in propaganda-rich but information-poor environment. So still a lot of people just follow the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un unconditionally. But I understand that it is hard to reaching out to the ordinary North Korean people, but there are many human rights activists and the missionary groups are there. So they have taken to flying balloons to North Korea, the droppings, hundreds of thousands of anti-regime leaflets, along with small radios, Bibles, rice, medicine, USB sticks, and cash. The USB sticks contain the South Korean TV dramas, movies, and songs. They definitely help open the North Korean people's eye to outside the world. In fact, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un demanded the South Korean government to stop them. So actually, just after Kim Jong-un's sister, Kim Yo-jong, criticized the balloons, and the North-South Joint Liaison Office in the Kaesong Industrial Complex was blown up. So in the end, the South Korean government and ruling party passed a bill to prevent sending of balloons. So I think it is definitely a law to prevent freedom of expression, and also it also blocks the North Korean people the right to know, and it's also anti-humanitarian punishment since it blocks even the minimum amount of rice and medicine from sending to North Korea. I believe that the role of the media in fostering peace on the Korean Peninsula is to target the ordinary North Korean people with information about their government and outside the world, that to let them choose how to act on that information. I know that reaching out to ordinary people is not easy because they are still isolated from us, but we have not given up them. So North Korea is not giving up its nuclear weapons, which are obstacles on the road to peace on the Korean Peninsula. The North Korea's economic situation is very bad due to the prolonged sanction against North Korea and the lockdown policies related to COVID-19. The North Korea's economy in 2020 posted its sharpest drop since the deadly famine in 1990s. That means that Kim Jong-un's pledge to improve living condition in the country failed. To try to divert people's attention, Kim Jong is maybe sending a signal to the Biden administration for dialogue, but I'm not sure. So because Moon Jae-in administration is at the end of its term, so it seems unlikely that a dialogue will resume again. So one thing I'm concerned is that younger generation in South Korea nowadays is not interested in reunification. Yes, even my generation often sang a song, our wish is unification, but younger generation doesn't probably know that song. According to the statistic published by Seoul National University last year, between 30 to 35% of people in their 20s and 30s answer that the unification is not necessary at all. The current government dismissed the unification. The unification is not realistic, and they usually say that coexisting with the North Korean regime is true peace on the Korean Peninsula. But I think this kind of idea is a bigger problem. That's because peace on the Korean Peninsula is possible only when unification is completely achieved. So I think the people of South and North Korea must share a joint awareness to maintain the single identity. And also for that to happen, the media should contribute towards reducing the quantitative and qualitative gap of knowledge and information between two Koreas. The co-founders of the Seoul Times, Reverend Moon Sung-myung and Dr. Hak Ja-han-moon, established the national unification as the first goal of the Seoul Times. So I'm sure that the Seoul Times need to encourage and educate the South Koreans to pay more attention to reunification for especially for the younger generation. And I think so we also have to increase our efforts to awaken the North Korean people to the realities of their country and the duplicity of their leader. So this is the way to open wide the air of the heavenly, the unified Korea. So I think that is the role of the media. Also, that the Second Times have a burden to push it this kind of goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Wang. So the Second Times has got a big mission cut out for themselves. This is the unification of Korea, right?
Yeah.
So I have one short question for you. You've got 1 minute to answer. You said you believe in the reunification of Korea should be achieved in the most peaceful way. One of the best ways to tell the North Koreans the truth about the outside world. This is one of the best ways. My question is, does the South Korean and Asian media have the will to break the North Korean regime's firewall against all outside information? And what would be the best way to overcome this barrier?
Yeah, as I said, the way to give the people of North Korea information directly is very narrow. So that's why I said we need a sending of balance to North Korea, but it's hard to because of the law. But anyways, there are some shortwave broadcastings and YouTube channels to deliver information to North Korean people. But however, I know that the mainly North Korean defector groups are operating them, not media. But even though North Korea is a very closed society, but I think internet and shortwave broadcasting still can be effective ways to give them some outside world information. So if we are capable to do such a thing, it might be a good idea to give it a try.
Okay, thank you. Well, I hope so. I hope that we'll be capable. So let me introduce our next speaker from the United States of America. His name is Guy Taylor, National Security Team Leader, Foreign Policy Reporter, The Washington Times, USA. Guy Taylor is the National Security Team Leader for The Washington Times, and he is an award-winning foreign correspondent currently overseeing the Times State Department and intelligence community coverage. Mr. Taylor has engaged in extensive international reporting over the last 20 years, from Latin America to the Middle East and the Asia Pacific. His exhaustive coverage of US policy towards North Korea crisis has won accolades from across the political spectrum. His reporting on Russia's attempts to influence the 2016 USA elections was recognized by a Gerald Ford Journalism Prize for distinguished reporting on the presidency. Mr. Guy Taylor, you are on.
Hello, thank you, Peter. Thank you to the Universal Peace Federation, to the International Leadership Conference, and to the International Media Association for having me here and for really this very interesting discussion. Also, thanks to Tom McDevitt. You and Peter are so instrumental in putting together these important conversations. Youngmi Huang, I also follow your work, and I appreciated your comments. I particularly appreciated your emphasis on the importance of getting information into North Korea. I think that's something we have to focus on and talk more about as journalists, not even as activists, just as journalists. Andy Salmon, it's so good to see you, man. I've been looking up to Andy as a mentor and journalist probably for almost 20 years and have known him for probably 15 and feel lucky every time I see him because he's such a gracious host to in Seoul. I enjoyed your comments, Andy, on you brought up collective consciousness and this idea, this human consciousness, and this idea of journalism's role in shaping it. I hope I'm going to touch on that in just a few remarks that I have to offer here as a USA, Washington, D.C. based international affairs journalist who has made many visits to the Asia Pacific. I've reported extensively on a range of issues in Northeast Asia pertaining to North Korea, China, South Korea, Japan. Really what I believe are the key pillars of responsibility for both for government sponsored, but also especially for private and nonprofit news media and communication companies in the region, as well as those that cover the region from outside, such as from the United States. And while it might at times seem like there's a dwindling number of outlets that cover U.S. outlets that cover the region, in fact, there's a pretty rich landscape of news outlets based in the U.S. that are reporting on and from East Asia. One of the primary pillars is, in my view, is to promote and maintain awareness that free market democratic societies should tolerate and not be intimidated by the presence of a free media space that's full of political opposition and critical debate or criticism of government leadership. Healthy free market democracies should be promoting and appreciating a healthy amount of freedom in the media space. And what I'm talking about specifically are the sort of diverse mix of independent media of many different political leanings across print, radio, television landscapes. Of course, all of it online in South Korea and Japan. This is with regard to Northeast Asia specifically, but then also you see it in the Philippines, you see it in Indonesia and others. With regard to the rest of the region, free media in these countries, I believe, has a vital role in really has a responsibility to promote an understanding and an appreciation for how very different these media spaces are from China or North Korea, that are controlled tightly by the authoritarian apparatus of the state. The same, albeit to a slightly lesser degree, is true in Russia. It follows that media and democratic societies of the Asia Pacific must continue to retain the right of private ownership. It must also promote awareness of propaganda that's infiltrating the international information space, often masquerading as news generated and projected by authoritarian government-controlled or government-owned media, most notably from China, but also very much from North Korea and Russia. And I can't emphasize this enough, because this idea of propaganda emanating from a country like China that has an increasingly powerful economic instrument of power, it's something we really we've got to pay attention to and have a healthy debate about. I think the pillar of media freedom, if we can call it that, is what separates freedom-loving society or freedom-appreciating societies of Asia Pacific from authoritarianism. And I think the implications of this are big, because they reach well beyond the news media, and they reach into the cultural, artistic, and even, of course, the religious space as well. And the implications are also increasingly tied to new media spaces. Just go talk to your journalist colleagues that are under 30 or those who are in their early 20s even, especially social media over the past decade, we've seen collective consciousness expressed through social media spaces in totally unprecedented ways in societies around the world. Some of these expressions have been unimaginably positive, and some have been, and often it feels like most have been frighteningly negative. But I believe we need to embrace social media and freedom in the social media space. And I think we have to have an open and responsible and conscientious debate about it and how to continue shaping that space in a way that's positive. It doesn't just foster divisiveness in democratic societies and free societies, and also be aware of how that space is being manipulated by those authoritarian projections that I was mentioning. That being said, one of the overarching points here is that anyone working in the free media space in the Asia Pacific, I believe, should be aware and open to promoting an awareness of what the alternatives to that free media space are. And the alternatives I'm talking about are these authoritarian spaces where no criticism of those in power is tolerated, no real criticism, or where ownership of information, ideas, politics, and culture are concentrated not in the hands of the people or anyone, but they're concentrated in a very small number of authoritarian hands. And a second primary pillar here that I want to try to address is this idea of conscientiousness. That I believe media in the Asia Pacific and anywhere around the world, the United States especially right now, should have this conscientiousness towards civil political discourse. Just because media space supports freedom and freedom of debate and criticism, that should not be an excuse for crass or base or racist or insulting rhetoric, or an opening for exploitation by radical elements of a given society. This, of course, is a point that could be a little bit delicate and debatable in democratic society. But I think, based on my own experience working in the US media now for more than 20 years, I believe conscientiousness to civil political discourse is a goal that should be pursued by all societies. And it's especially important in democracies, which are notoriously messy and intrinsically prone to political upheaval and rebirth as a matter of practice. I think it's really important as we debate the concept of normalcy in these new media or social media spaces. And I think the way to address it is in conferences like we're having right now, where seasoned and responsible media professionals can openly talk about it and say, look, it's okay to call people out who are being irresponsible or unnecessarily divisive just for the sake of being divisive on social media. I'd finally like to just say a couple things on, what I believe is the need for free media in the Asia Pacific to push for openings of coverage, information and communications, openings, particularly with regard to China and North Korea. While the government of China tolerates a limited presence of foreign media, it's really been flirting in the Xi Jinping era with eradicating that presence altogether, particularly with regard to major US news organizations. And I think everybody should be wary of that and should stand up for the need for foreign media to continue to be allowed to report from inside China, including all over the country, particularly as hopefully we really get to the post-COVID era. But think about reporting in Wuhan, where the pandemic is believed to have begun. Also in Xinjiang province, where it's not just the US government, but a good number of governments around the world have accused the Chinese government or the Chinese authorities of basically carrying out a genocide against Muslims and ethnic minorities. So you can't really get in there to report. And if you do, Andy gave us an example of just even being outside China on the North Korea-China, or in China on the border with North Korea. There's a lot of interference being run by Chinese authorities. Beijing, of course, claims the accusations against it are baseless. I think that China should allow outside journalists into these areas. With regard to North Korea, the whole world might benefit from more coordination among free media companies, not only from the Asia Pacific, but also from the West, that could be, I think, working more effectively together to actually petition the North Korean government or get a message to the Kim regime to hold conferences, inviting foreign media into the country, if only to create a basic opening for coverage, but also just for civil society dialogue between Pyongyang and the rest of the world that's really been stifled for too long. And I think this could come from something like a film festival or other kind of media-related festivals. It could be some kind of a conference that's not necessarily overtly political. I know that this is a little bit of a lofty idea, but it's something to hope for. And in the interim, I do think that media outlets should do more to cover the flow of information or the lack of flow of information into North Korea via digital communications and other means, and to really home in on, I don't think there's enough coverage of the debate about restrictions being placed on those flows, not just by the North Koreans, but by some other governments in the region. And when we reflect on this idea of collective consciousness, it's mind-boggling to me to think of how different the collective consciousness is in North Korea from how it is in South Korea, and how the reason for that difference really is rooted, I think, in the fact that there's this free media in South Korea, and there's a total lack of it in the North. I will conclude here just by saying how much I personally, as a journalist and a storyteller, appreciate the free media space that does exist in the Asia Pacific, how much I and others in the US media rely upon free English language streams of information that exist in the region, especially those emanating from South Korea. I'm very excited personally about the prospect of hopefully regularly traveling to the region again. I know that continues to be in flux because of the ongoing challenges of the pandemic. And that's it for me. Thank you very much for having me on this esteemed panel.
Thank you, Talon. We love journalists with lofty ideas. We need them. And the key word is press freedom for creating peace on the Korean Peninsula. So I have one question. We are really running out of time. Very, very brief question. Just you mentioned the need for free media in Asia Pacific to push for openings of coverage, information, and communications, both with China and North Korea. Do you think that IMAP and its affiliated news outlets, as well as organizations that advocate press freedom, could play a role in creating a global lobby to push for this opening? You've got 1 minute.
Absolutely. I think that one of the things about independent organizations that are not tied to government is that they have that ability to come in and project a kind of neutrality, and that neutrality can be a springboard to attract buy-in from partners who might otherwise reject an initiative on its face. And what I'm talking about is North Korea. So yes, absolutely. I think IMAP has as good a chance, if not a better chance, than any other organization that I've been exposed to of convincing North Korean authorities to open some kind of a collaborative event. This has happened actually prior to, I'm in my mid 40s at this point as a journalist. It happened when I was just starting out as a journalist, I think. And then it's been a closed space since. So that's 25 years where the idea of a civil society gathering, I know that Young Mi mentioned this, the idea of getting into Pyongyang there have been some interactions between North Korean and South Korean journalists, and there are other countries in the world that don't involve U.S. officials and journalists getting into Pyongyang. So yes, and IMAP touches those other countries. I mean, Peter, you're in Paris, it's all over the world. So I think the short answer is absolutely yes. You know, the role of an independent organization, civil society organization like this, can't be overstated. It's very important.
Thank you. Very good. Very good. You
Yes,
see this young lady. You see this young lady there. Her name is Sandra Strotsky. She is a university student in international business and finance, and currently she's doing her internship in General Electric's American company, right? Supporting controllership within a company. So I leave it with that. She's a brilliant young lady, and she will introduce to you questions from the audience, but we only have 10 minutes time.
Yes, exactly.
Sandra.
So thank you very much, Peter. And yes, I think I'll just ask the very first question here, which is, how can the media inform the South Korean young population to show objectively the positive result of a potential reunification? I think this is a question more to Ms. Fang or Mr. Salmon.
So you mean, so how comes the young people don't want unification? Okay.
Yes, yes.
I think for young people, so their interest and happiness are important. You know, so they don't think that the value of reunification is doesn't make their lives better. A few years ago, former president said that the unification is a jackpot. That means if the unification take place, Korea will become a country with a population as 80 million people. Will progress economically. But for the young generation, given the level of the North Korean economy and the income of North Korean people, the younger generation think that they have to feed the North Korean. So they don't want to do that. They just want to their interest and their happiness. So actually, that's why I talked about the education. The role of the media should educate and persuade the people how the value of unification is great. So I wanna talk with the young people as our nation, as one nation. Should we leave the people of North Korea people like that? It's that they are under so miserable situation. But as one nation, should we just leave them like that? So, and also, how long will we live in a divided small country? I think, as Mr. Salmon said, that the South Korea is a really great country. We can be bigger and bigger, and we have to do more something for the world peace. So I wanna talk to the younger generation. We have to dream. We have to dream about the one big country. But nowadays, because of the tough economic situation, younger generation in South Korea don't much interest in the unification. It's a shameful.
Thank you.
Let me just add, if I may, that I mean, you know, unification is not a story. It's not happening. It's not a news story. There's no plan for it. There's no strategy. There's no process. It's literally not happening. It's not on the horizon. So media cover news, right? So if you want to make the young people interested in it, and frankly, right now, I would agree. I don't think the young people are interested in it. It's not in their vision at the moment. It shouldn't be media who do this. It should be popular culture. If you want to get the attention of young people, you need BTS to be talking about unification. You need, Black Velvet to be talking about unification. You need Bong Joon-ho to be talking about unification and making movies about it. That's how you're going to grab the attention of the young people, not just in Korea, but around the world. I don't think media is quite as powerful at grabbing the attention of youth as popular culture is, for better or worse.
Yeah.
Great point.
I see. Thank you very much. Anyone, any other comments maybe on this question?
I couldn't agree more with this point about popular culture. I spent a month in Seoul 3 years ago interviewing university students about a concert that Kim Jong-un had allowed in Pyongyang of K-pop, basically. And this had young people giggling about whether or not this leader in the North could be considered. My question to them was, could you consider his body type sexy? I thought that was a fun question for university students. And the answers I got, some of them we published in the Washington Times, were totally interesting, because people would giggle and say, well, no, but actually, there's something appealing about him. And I thought that is totally interesting. But why? Because of pop culture, the idea of movies. And then I think Young-Mi brought up social media, or somebody brought up social media. Maybe it was you, Tom. And the idea of young North Korean defectors who aren't just talking to obscure American or South Korean activist civil society groups, but young North Korean defectors who actually have a following on social media suddenly, from thousands of other young people who are suddenly awake to this as something that's not some stodgy, boring news story, but actually, wait a minute, there are people like me not very far away who are going through what? What exactly is going on? So I don't know how a group like those of us on this panel can impact that. There's something about social media that has a life of its own. I also like the idea of movies. Movies as a way of getting information to young people. Very important. That's it.
I jump in very quickly with this one observation. I mean, there's no question that the Korean culture, the K-pop music, as well as Korea dramas, have become one of the hottest cultural channels in the world, all over the world. So I think South Korea is perfectly positioned, perhaps together with Hollywood and Bollywood, to create a whole new genre of what does the future of Korea look like? What does the future of Asia look like? That's why people like Jim Rogers of Singapore got involved with the World Summit and continues to be involved, because he sees the economic future once the 38th parallel becomes a peaceful channel of transition. I think that's a great theme for a conference.
Thank you.
Just one. Yeah, when it comes to unification, so I think so we have to talk about also the younger generation in North Korea. I mean, so we call the 장마당 generation. 장마당 means it's the market, and they experience the value of the property and trading. So I mean, younger generation in North Korea probably they start thinking about the South Korea and changing the North Korean regime. So we also have to focus on the changing the among the generation in North Korea.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all your answers. I didn't expect that. And especially this question was very important to me as a young person listening to this conference. So thank you very much. Another question, it's actually to all of you, but I think it was you, Mr. McDevitt, speaking about responsible and moral media. There's a question that came in asking, is a responsible and moral media incompatible to a communist regime and the North Korean system?
I don't think so at all. I mean, I think responsible media is media that recognizes that criticism of power structures, one, it recognizes that power belongs in the hands of the people. And two, that criticism of power structures can be made in a mature and calm way. And that's every time you go into a professional meeting as a journalist and that is not, someone is not standing up for that actually mainstream media or peripheral mainstream media that's serious is able to speak truth to power in a calm way. So there's a reason that the opinion pages are not on the front. They're inside the paper. Because if you want to go find them, they're there. I'm sorry?
I would just add that, you know, for those who say that communism and good journalism is somehow incompatible, I mean, it seems like a no-brainer. But if you believe that, I would say read the works of Wassily Grossman, the Red Army journalist who was at, Jewish Red Army journalist who was at Stalingrad, he was at Kursk, he was at Berlin, and he also was at the liberation of the death camp in Treblinka in early 1945. And what he wrote about what he saw and experienced in the worst place in the world, what someone who survived both Auschwitz and Treblinka said, Auschwitz was a holiday camp compared to what happened at Treblinka. Read what Grossman read about that. It's called The Hell of Treblinka. I think you can find it online. It's some of the finest engaged moral journalism you'll read from any place or any era.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we only have 10 minutes and that only means 2 questions this time. But thank you very much for your comments. And I think the screen is yours, Mr. Peter Turin. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Wonderful, Sandra. Now, since we are running a bit late, I would like to ask one question to the panel, and whoever wants can reply, but we need to take notice of the time. And then we want to wrap it up with just a final statement, 1-minute statement by each of the panelists. Okay, so the question is, does the panel think there is scope for the organization of more media exchange and information visits to the Korean Peninsula, north and south, for foreign journalists to encourage them to produce more balanced coverage on the human and shared cultural side of the relationship? Anyone can reply.
It's already happening. The South Korean government is consistently inviting foreign reporters in for a range of press tours. The problem is not South Korea, the problem is North Korea. I mean, in North Korea, embassies have recently been closed. To the best of my knowledge, the few foreign media organizations, Xinhua, TASS, have pulled out their correspondence. And the American and Western news organizations, AP and AFP, which have bodies on the ground, don't actually have foreign bodies on the ground. They borrow people from the North Korea Central News Agency. So I'm not in any way upbeat on the possibility of foreign media getting into North Korea anytime soon. They're more closed off now than they've ever been in my experience as a journalist here in 20 years. That having been said, what Jungmi was talking about is tremendously important. These tiny activist groups here in South Korea sending balloons, these are independent organizations actually generating policy statements from Pyongyang. Imagine if a media organization, imagine even if the US government got involved in this kind of initiative, which is flying or somehow sending free and open information to North Korea. Imagine if a tiny activist group can have such an impact. How might a larger organization have a much greater impact? That's a real question which, were I in the US intelligence community, I would be mulling, quite deeply.
Okay, thank you. Just
Peter,
one more.
Peter,
Yeah,
Peter, could I comment? I want to pick up on what Andrew said. I wholeheartedly agree.
Right.
And in terms of an interesting historical context in the Cold War is the World Media Association that did dozens and dozens of pretty high-level fact-finding trips behind the Iron Curtain down into Central America, into Africa during the height of the Cold War, taking journalists there, resulting in that big conference in the Soviet Union and a hookup with Mr. Gorbachev. I think also the Washington Times guys participated in this with people like Ambassador Chris Hill and Joe Detrani, folks like that. We've done about a dozen fact-finding trips to South Korea, focused on the Korean Peninsula. I would really encourage this panel, Andrew and Guy and Jungmi, especially with your experience. Let's explore how we could do some new fact-finding trips on this issue. And I'd propose, Guy, let's plan a conference in Beijing first for IMAP, and secondly into Pyongyang. The final point, I'm absolutely fascinated with the fact that UPF has got connections and boots on the ground, so to speak, in 160 countries. I understand that the DPRK has diplomatic relations, although some of those embassies have closed, but with Cambodia, with Nepal, with some of these countries that still maintain a fluid relationship. There are folks there that are like you, supporting these issues. And I think a comprehensive effort of international diplomacy or public diplomacy could have a real impact. Final point, Harvard Belfer Institute, headed up by Dr. Gian Baek, she wrote the book on the hidden underground information flow into Korea. They just published this report on public diplomacy that was a group of top Korean experts published it just a couple of weeks ago. I'll put it up on the chat, but it was given to the Biden administration to make public diplomacy, which is the space we're in generally, part of foreign policy, an official foreign policy for the US and other countries. I think there's a lot of work that we can contribute there in that space. So I'll put that link up there for people, but would love to work with you guys on building some plans for real conferences, just like Jungmi and I and Peter put together in Seoul back in February 2020. Let's do that in Beijing, then in Pyongyang. I'm calling for the motion on that one. So,
okay, thank you, Tom. Mr. McDavid just made a big declaration, so let's keep him up to date on this. Okay, now I really need to ask you to make just a 1-minute statement, each of the panelists. Why not start, Mrs. Huang? Why not start with a short statement?
Sorry, it was a really great time. So thanks for giving me an opportunity to participate in the conference. Yeah, they say that God helps those who help themselves. So that means the peace on the Korean Peninsula is not made for free. So I think we need to push our efforts. It's possible only if South Korean and North Korean people really want to reunificate our country. So I think our job is to make it. So the role of the media have to focus on educating the people, and also, as I said, that we probably insistently to give them a true information. So I do my best, and then welcome to your supporting. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next, who wants to be next for the final statement?
I want to say thank you again for having me. I mean, it is a very interesting discussion here, and this is how it's advanced. Just participating in public diplomacy is part of journalism. I mean, and I think it's It's interesting, Tom, that you brought up this Belfer Center document. I also think, Andrew, your comments about balloons going into North Korea and what would happen if the U.S. government was involved in that. We actually had a story, I did a story last year in the Washington Times about Suzanne Schulte's organization, the North Korea Freedom Coalition, and the struggles they were having a State Department contract to do media promotion into North Korea, and that State Department canceled the contract and they were having troubles with it. So there is some U.S. government support for this, and it doesn't get a lot of media attention, but it's there, and it is an interesting question, because the difficulty with that came during the Trump administration, which was actually ironically very much trying to have direct top-down diplomacy with the Kim regime in the North. So it's a delicate issue, and it's an interesting one. In conclusion, I just hope that this conversation continues and that there is progress. And Tom, your idea of a media conference in Beijing, I think is a very good one. And let me know how I can help in any way. Thank you.
Great. Super. Okay. Who wants to be next?
Andrew was going to go.
I guess that's me. Let me just make a couple of points, picking up on what various people have said. I mean, you're talking about media engagement. And to be honest, as well as the balloon flyers, there is actually highly effective media engagement with North Korea. And that's come through just a handful of very, very small, underfunded outlets in Seoul and in Tokyo, which are supplying smuggling smartphones into North Korea, and they're actually getting telephone reports from boots on the ground inside North Korea. Again, that's an initiative, I think, which really needs greater support and greater funding. And again, to pick up on something which Jungmi said, which was that, unification seems so far distant, given that, the two Koreas can meet, and Koreans from both sides of the frontier can meet, and yet they seem so different, although they share the same language and the same culture and much of the same history. This is hugely problematic. Let's be brutally frank about this. There's no process for unification. There's no strategy for unification. There's no ongoing agreement on unification between the two Koreas. Most of the players in the region support the status quo ante. Most of the people, I think, in South Korea, it's just not on their agenda. It's not an issue. So unification, offers the possibility of sunlit uplands for millions of people in North Korea, massive commercial benefits for South Korea, population and demographic benefits for South Korea, the evaporation of a casus belli in Northeast Asia, the opening of an entirely new market for the global corporate community. There are so many pluses, but the costs and the risks of achieving it are abysmal. They're huge. They're massive. And so while I would like to talk up the potential of unification, I don't see it happening anytime soon. But if it does happen, I think it'll happen like German unification overnight, and it's going to shock and surprise us all. And on a very, very final point, clearly we're seeing a clash now. The clash has moved from Russia or the USSR versus the West to China versus the West. And China is a much more formidable force, given their economic power, given their cultural, underpinning in the region. But This is not a done deal. This is not a lost war. Take a look at South Korea. South Koreans, ethnically, culturally, linguistically, are Asian, but I would say in their beliefs, their aspirations, their behaviors, and their values, South Koreans are basically of the same mind as democratic peoples in the Western world.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. The final statement now by Mr. McDavid. Okay.
Thanks, Peter. I know we're running short of time. Great points, Andrew, Guy, and Jungmi. To the point that Andrew just talked about, the need for a comprehensive approach of strategy, innovation. one of the projects we're launching that you're all invited to be part of in a way is Think Tank 2022. It's a fabulous idea of literally building a network, which is in process, of thought leaders and practitioners in various disciplines, policy, military, security, economic, humanitarian, cultural, human rights, etc., to the tune of 2022, i.e. Think Tank 2022, around the world. Half of those in South Korea and the rest are around the world. And a lot of us are very involved in that. And I think the thought leadership and the innovation that's starting to come forth from a lot of career people that have been on this issue for decades is absolutely fascinating. And that's an area, there's a lot of good sources, a lot of good stories that are going to come from that as people look at different approaches to solve the problem. Final point, I'll say another great asset that's happening, a phenomenon, is the emerging voice of defectors from North Korea. One in particular that maybe you might be familiar with is Youngmi Park, young lady who came out 10, 12 years ago. But I think she's got something like 650,000 followers on YouTube. And she's articulate, went to Columbia University, but I see that phenomenon occurring where a younger generation of defectors are building social media followings and causing a whole generation of people to ask questions like, what the heck is happening behind this 38th parallel? Why are people suffering so much? How do you change this? So I see a potential cultural shift, a critical mass that's occurring to cause a tipping point in public opinion, or to use that phrase of collective consciousness. Great to be part of this group. Let's meet soon in Seoul and then eventually in Beijing.